Noon, good evening, and possibly even good morning. And thank you for joining us for our next event of the term, which comes today from members of the Fair Work Foundation project, a research team here at the OII. Today, they will be discussing the subject, Unpaid Labour in the Platform Economy, a typology of wage theft in the digital age. A little housekeeping, we are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following this event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. Questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Matthew Cole and Dr. Kelle Howson.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It's a pleasure to be here today to be the discussant for this OII webinar and to introduce my colleague, Matt Cole, who will be giving the talk. So Dr. Matthew Cole is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, working on the Fair Work project. Fair Work is committed to highlighting best and worst practices in the emerging platform economy by evaluating platforms against global measures of fairness. Beyond the project, Matt's academic interests are interdisciplinary, revolving around the political economy and sociology of work and technology. Recent research has involved themes such as the social shaping of the platform economy, trade union responses to digitalization, and unpaid labour. And I'll hand over to you, Matt. I'm really looking forward to this talk.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm just going to share my screen now. All right, so thanks everybody for joining. I want to give a disclaimer that this is very much a work in progress. So any feedback you have, I'll be very appreciative of in the questions, and also, be forgiving when I'm presenting it, because I'm trying to think about how best to theorize this at the same time as trying to organize the data and organize the argument in a narrative form that makes sense. So just to introduce you to the material, the talk is based on data collected through the Fair Work project. You may be familiar with it, but the Fair Work project is a global project operating in 25 different countries, and our aim is to provide scores for both gig work and cloud work platforms and improve working conditions. The paper begins from the premise that extant analysis of unpaid labor and wage theft are limited to violations of labor law, and this neglects the systemic dimension of unpaid labor under capitalism. So based on qualitative data, the paper, or the presentation, soon to be paper, explores how digital labor platforms have specific characteristics that make workers more vulnerable to unpaid labor and wage theft, particularly piecework and misclassification. And there's also a sort of digital data component. The outline is right here in front of you, just to give you sort of an orientation of where we're going. So I'll start with a bit of a conceptual framework, historical background, and then go into a little bit more sort of empirical context for unpaid labor in the UK, specifically the enforcement mechanisms that exist, and sort of trouble of platforms and where this sort of particular element inserts itself into the labor market. For you sort of methods people, I do include a methods slide as well, and then we'll go into the findings and then some of the discussion. So wage theft, a bit of a longer view. So I want to sort of begin from the premise that unpaid labor equals wage theft. These are thoroughly bound up with each other, and I don't think these concepts can really be disconnected. I also talk about unpaid labor specifically in relation to the wage and the wage form. I don't want to get into debates around sort of domestic labor or other kinds of unpaid work in the home. This is specifically in the sort of lineage of the wage form and the employment form. So in that context, I want to sort of draw connections between unpaid labor and under industrial capitalism, and there's the way that the capitalist labor process developed out of previous forms of organization of work, such as feudal and corvée systems. The corvée system is a good example because there's a sort of quasi-bonded or forced labor situation, but it was a very specific quantity of days that people were required to work for a lord, or sometimes in the case of colonial relations for the colonial power, such as France, which, for example, in the metropole, beyond the metropole, required many like up to 12 to 20 days annually of workers in some of its colonies, all the way up till 1946. So there are other histories, like specific to this country, largely drawing around like unpaid labor, that also draw on the right to property, whether it be John Locke or it be Adam Smith. Even before then, during Locke's time, you had the levelers and the reactions against the enclosures movement, which was largely feudal lords enacting their power based on property to take communal land and appropriate it as theirs. So the idea of like unpaid labor is related to property, and the idea of theft, both of these have a longer history. The Marxist point of view tries to synthesize these, both in terms of primitive accumulation, which Marx talks about in Capital with reference to the enclosures, but also in some of his earlier writings on the theft of wood. This is a sort of historicization of the concept of property and theft. And then he also historicizes labor in a similar way, comparing it to feudal and slave labor in the chapter on the working day. So I have some quotes here. All his labor appears as unpaid labors in wage labor. On the contrary, even surplus labor or unpaid labor appears as paid. Actually, that quote should start in wage labor. But anyway, basically, he's comparing the property relation of slave labor or feudal labor to the money mediated relations of wage labor under capitalism. In addition to that, though, beyond the sort of normal exploitation of paid and unpaid, Marx talks about using the factory reports as, you know, one of many sources of empirical data. Thomas Piketty seems to think that Marx doesn't rely on data, but there's quite a lot in there. And one of the things that these reports point to are these small thefts from workers' meal times, recreation times, petty pilferings of minutes, and just various ways that the employer steals time, right? And so in this framework, I sort of use this lens, and we will return to it later to understand unpaid labor in the platform economy. So for those who aren't familiar with the general labor laws in the UK and the sort of platform economy more specifically, I will explain some of that in this section. So to begin with, we need to understand how working time works, what is classified under working time. So largely in the UK, this relates to the national minimum wage legislation or living wage legislation, now that the Conservatives have rebranded it, and the European Working Time Directive. So working time includes far more things than just active time. So we think, oh, you turn up to work, when you're doing your activities, that's working time. When they stop, that's when it ends. But no, there is more. So time spent at work, but actually not working, but just sort of being on standby near the workplace, i.e. rest, waiting time, for example, that's considered working time. Time not working because of the machine breakdown, but you have to sort of wait at the workplace to just be present or collect goods, also working time. Time that you might have to travel to meet someone, so academics, going to conferences, or just participating in conferences in general, this is also working time. Time spent training or traveling to training is also working time, and time spent at work or under work-related responsibilities, even when workers are allowed to sleep. So sleeping on the job is also working time in certain contexts. So the other important thing that we need to understand is how pay is calculated. So time work, hourly wages, this is very straightforward, right? You get a certain amount of money per hour. In salaried jobs, this is slightly more complicated, but the workload is calculated for whatever your hours are, 35, 37.5, 40, or up to 48, which is the legal maximum. But it's, you know, an hourly pay, right? And you get paid annual hours and so on. Output work or piecework, slightly different. And the way that this must be calculated is what they call a fair rate system. A bit of fair washing going on here, but regardless of the name, this is calculated by counting the number of tasks or pieces completed per hour, dividing the minimum wage by that number to establish a base rate, and then multiplying it by 1.2 to account for sort of time in between or setup time. And this supposedly is roughly should equal a minimum wage. It's required by law to be tested on a group of workers, so not just the fastest one. And crucially, the employer needs to provide documentation of how this calculation is carried out and what the estimates are. So this is all in the law, right? You'll see why this is important later when I'm talking about piecework in relation to platform work. In terms of the enforcement bodies in the UK, it's quite disaggregated, really. There's been efforts recently by David Metcalf, the Director of Labour Market Enforcement, to get a lot more money to update and sort of streamline the enforcement bodies. But as you can see, there are three different main bodies here that are statutory, like regulators. The likelihood that you'd get an inspection from one of these is incredibly low. I think it's in the millions or something like that. There's this great paper report that draws this out by I think Nick Clark and Herman. But basically, these only cover really extreme cases, and they're not very effective. Unsurprisingly, we have, you know, a huge amount of unpaid labor and violations in the UK. So in 2019, based on a TUC survey, there were 5 million workers that out of 5 million workers, they contributed 2 billion unpaid hours in 2018. This is about 7 hours a week per worker. So almost an entire day, and roughly translates to 32.7 billion of free labor every year. In addition, workers lost another 2.6 billion for non-payment of holiday entitlements and non-compliance with the minimum wage. So this is wage theft. This is formal wage theft or unlawful deductions of wages. And we know this because these are employees and they're union members, so they know their rights, they have some representation. The odds that all people understand when they're doing unpaid labor and that this is calculable, this is another question. It's highly unlikely that most people even realize their full rights or that these are being violated. And another one of the issues is most of the literature is framed in terms of unpaid labor as labor market violations, as if if everything were paid correctly, there would still be no unpaid labor. And we'll sort of return to that problem a bit later. So just to give you an idea of the compliance spectrum that we're looking at, in platform labor, we're kind of on the sort of side of negligent, or maybe in some cases collusion. And there's, you know, work can get far worse, like, you know, working in domestic service or working in agriculture or hospitality, which is what I did my PhD on. These rates of violations can be much, much higher, especially when you have agencies and gangmasters involved, and you can get, you know, issues of like serious cases of forced labor. We're not looking at that so much as on the sort of more green end of the spectrum. So in this context, like the platform economy kind of fits in there a little bit, but it's it's not really the same as these more traditional industries, right? Because a digital labor platform is a kind of specific way of mediating work that leverages digital resources to control interactions between consumers and service providing workers, and then extract a surplus from that, whether that be surplus value, whether that just be like market rents or data rents or other forms of accumulation, right? Globally, digital labor platforms have increased massively from 142 in 2010 to over 777 in 2020, according to the ILO. And most of these are concentrated in the US, hosting nearly 30%, followed by India with 8%, and the UK with 5%. And given the sort of population differences between these different countries, these are quite stark and surprising. My presentation and this future paper is going to focus on one type of digital labor platform, which is gig work, or geographically tethered work. The other kind, main kind of gig work is online or cloud work, which is non-geographically tethered. And that sort of work has specific issues that accompany it. And we'll be doing some more research on that in the future. So where does the UK fit in? So, I mean, you can see from 2010 to 2019, there was a huge increase in these gig platforms, as well as huge increase in smartphone usage, and therefore people downloading the apps, using the apps. And, you know, Uber was, you know, with 30,000 Londoners installing it on every day by 2016. I imagine the increased users are still going up. We can check out those figures on Crunchbase if you want. But the point is that it's basically part of our transport infrastructure, but it isn't regulated by anyone. Well, I mean, you have the Supreme Court giving them orders here and there, but, you know, we'll get to that a little bit later. Overall, the gig economy is difficult to measure, and this is the case around the world. There isn't adequate classifications or national statistics on this. So some estimates put it, you know, quite a bit lower, but there's obviously been a huge increase since 2017. So there's another study by Hertfordshire that says it basically doubled from 2016 to 2019, and I'm sure it's gone up since the pandemic. So, you know, we're looking at 9.6% of the working age population, so 4 million plus. The main advantage, or the particular thing to platforms, is they have a sort of digital excuse to evade their statutory rights. So a lot of agencies or a lot of kind of lower end employers or companies would use self-employment contracts, like for cleaners or even for temporary hospitality workers or whatever, and they treat them as independent businesses. What the gig economy does is it just sort of exponentially expands this to anyone that has a smartphone, and this allows companies to avoid statutory employment protections, and, you know, this means that employees can't claim that they have unlawful deductions from wages, and, you know, unless they manage to prove that they are workers or not. And there's been plenty of cases brought by some of the leading independent unions challenging that. But this is one of the crucial problems of that platform model. So I promised you some methods. So here's some methods. Basically, this is a sort of offshoot of the broader Fair Work project. So overall, the Fair Work project relies on desk research and worker interviews as its main data source to sort of create ratings based on our 10-point scale around 5 principles, and there's 2 points for each principle. These principles are fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. There's a lot of detail on our website about that. This isn't about the Fair Work methodology necessarily. but it's integral to understanding, for example, what contract the worker has that reported, that they're getting underpaid, or reported that they're waiting excessive hours, versus, and understanding the mechanics of this and how the legal sphere intersects with the political economy sphere, right? So this paper draws on in-depth semi-structured interviews conducted by the Fair Work team, which I'm part of. And year one, we had 55 participants across 11 different platforms. And year two, we had 83 participants across 14 different platforms. And they're listed here. There's some of the main players: Just Eat, Deliveroo, Uber Eats. You've probably heard of all of them. Also, Pedal Me is a bit of a better platform. If you look at our ratings, and then this year we have some new players in the UK market: Get Here and Gorillas. So findings. Basically, the forms of unpaid labor that we found in platforms are obviously very similar to forms of unpaid labor in other forms of low-wage precarious working, right? So there's unpaid active time, there's unpaid training time, there's unpaid transit time between jobs. So like carers and cleaners, these resonate with a lot of them. A lot of platforms provide caring and cleaning services. There's a lot of overlap that aren't specific to the platforms, but where the specificity of the platforms comes out in the self-employed model, and even the sort of worker model when it comes to waiting time and entitlements, and then production costs. There's also the issue of expropriation of data and knowledge capture, and turning that into an intangible asset. There's a little bit more of a murky territory, but we can discuss some of that. So unpaid active time is what I'm calling this right now. It might change, but it's essentially a set amount of work time that workers know that they have worked. They're usually, if you're doing a shift, you keep track of that pretty closely because you have to be there on time, and then you want to get out as soon as you can. But in many different cases, we've had people either underpaid for half an hour, underpaid for 15 minutes every day, or having longer periods of time where they're not paid, or having entire shifts just canceled because the app fails. For example, the helpline cleaner. Several different help people who were working on helpline reported times where they went to a job, they started cleaning, the client canceled, and then they weren't paid because the app favors clients over workers, and because they're independent or they're self-employed contractors and they don't have any recourse to take action. And you can see this person worked for 3 hours and didn't get any money. So it's 3 hours for free. Add that on top of that, the cost of transport, and it's for some reason it's about 40 minutes to get anywhere in London, and probably more if you're traveling from an area where you can afford rent on a cleaner's salary to a place that can't afford to pay a cleaner. There are several examples from Just Eat and Gorillas, because these are some of the only fairly clear sort of time wage platforms. Just Eat has moved to what they call a scuba model for most of their careers, which is an hourly paid shift-based system. However, we had some of the more meticulous people that we interviewed report that slight fractions of underpayment. These are what Marx refers to, these sort of petty pilferings, these small thefts here and there, just little bits. But when you expand that to the scale of hundreds or thousands internationally, hundreds of thousands of people, this is a lot of money. Just moving the decimal place a little bit, like an office space, can do quite a lot. So another area that I mentioned, the unpaid waiting time. This is the most common form of unpaid work across all different platforms, concentrated in delivery and ride-hailing services. And we have some of the more horrendous stories of workers being really desperate during the pandemic, or even just trying their hardest to cobble together a living based on multi-apping, but still not being able to get enough hours or get enough deliveries, sitting there waiting for 3 hours and not getting paid for that because Deliveroo only pays per drop. Uber, Bolt, Ola pay per ride. They don't pay you for waiting on the app, you know. And this can be a lot of work time that they're missing out on, and making it, you know, when you average out the pay, it might make, you might make the living wage, you might make the minimum wage, or you might not. But particularly, like, it's also sort of regulated by, there's no shifts, so there's no limit to the number of drivers or riders that can sign up and sign in at any time. So you have more riders or drivers than available work. This is one of the things that the platform has control over, but they choose not to because they want to continue to have these precarious models. So another area, unpaid training and unpaid transit time. The transit time is a really important one, and very, only workers on hourly wages are essentially paid for transit time between jobs. Particularly cleaners, you know, they're having to spend money for a day travel card to go across London to go from one 2-hour cleaning job to another. It really lowers their wages. Some helping cleaners reported as well of being able to set their hourly rate below the minimum wage without, you know, having any sort of baseline for this, which is, you know, now it's unethical, but also would be, you know, illegal if they weren't independent contractors. It's a bit of a gray area for me. Maybe any labor lawyers can talk about that in the chat. But every worker I've spoken to thinks travel time between jobs should be compensated. This is also an area that draws on previous sort of employer practices, like there's some good articles about carers having to log as soon as they enter property and take care, and then not being able to be compensated for even walking 5 minutes down the road. Amazon Flex workers are another extremely precarious form of delivery, where they have to sort of keep refreshing shifts and try to game the system by staying in areas, but the algorithm has changed so that they have to change their tactics as well. And there's virtually no training on any of that. So it takes a while, often in many cases. For example, on TaskRabbit, you have to be available to, you know, perform, you know, various admin tasks that you don't get paid for. Some of the worst platforms, you have to bid for jobs. That's more common, I think, in cloud work, but it's still time that's working time. So, and then there's some broader issues of unpaid entitlements, holidays in particular. Obviously, if you're a self-employed contractor, you don't get any of that. This is currently being changed. I mean, as the Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers were workers, you had the sort of full scale of the amount of money that some of these platforms were saving by not paying holiday being revealed, right? So as in this forum, I found a couple of different people reporting what their pay was that they received, because they received some backdated pay from Uber, but it only goes for 2 years because the UK law has changed that you can't seek damages for more than 2 years. But even that, they said, you know, £5,100. They were, you know, if they were working for 4.5 years and they were offered all the money, they would have got a lot more. You know, this is still huge, you know, thousands of pounds. There's essentially wage theft that the company managed to retain after, you know, even after this ruling. There were lots of other examples from that forum. So another very specific form of, I guess, wage theft that tends to not be as common outside of platforms. I mean, obviously, if you're a self-employed contractor, you're your own business and you provide your own means of production if you're genuinely self-employed. But by classifying gig workers as self-employed, this is just avoiding any of the sort of costs that an employer's normally paying for. So, you know, costs of insurance, of gas or petrol, depending on what country you're in. You know, several of the Uber drivers listed what they pay, and you know, it's a huge amount of money. You know, this one says £700 per week in costs, right? In any kind of formal employment relation, a lot of this would be absorbed by the employer, and then they would just, you know, they would get paid their wage. This is a huge amount of money that the company is saving, and more importantly, it externalizes risk. You know, it's hugely risky to invest a lot of money in this sort of in buying different things, whether it be, you know, proper bike that's safe to ride on for Deliveroo, or, you know, renting your car for Uber driver, you know. But there's another area of data and paying for data and your phone, because most of them, they rely on these smartphones and they're not given them, right? There's only one company, Getir, that actually provides a phone. So, and the last thing that is a little bit more speculative is the expropriation of worker user data. So because platforms are very opaque, and there's not a lot of research on this beyond sort of theorizing, but it's really clear that when you look at the valuations of platforms, there are things that the data sets and their technology and the intangible assets are taken into account, right? So Uber's ongoing real-time data, understanding how traffic moves around like 80 different cities in the world, is a hugely important asset. Workers have no part, no share, no equity, no compensation for that. There are other examples of companies explicitly like saying, like Lyft, for example, hey, we, you know, put this camera on your car or rent this car from you, and you know, we will be mapping the city using this camera, right? This is what Van Dorn and Badger calls sort of dual value production, and is part of the sort of broader intangible economy. Just checking the chat. So now we're going to have a little bit of discussion. I have no idea where I am on time because my phone didn't start. But the question, do digital labor platforms systematically rely on unpaid labor? You might guess what my answer is, but why, right? So I think yes, but they do in different ways, and they use different tools. So to return to some of the marks that I introduced before, for those of you who aren't familiar with the sort of classical political economy, it's not just Marx, it's also Smith and Ricardo. They have variations on this theory of surplus labor and unpaid labor. But the basic concept is that unpaid labor time is the basis for surplus labor and profit, right? And, you know, there's also surplus value. This is for productive activities, but the point is you can work beyond the amount of time you would need to reproduce the organization that will reproduce your material means of existence. And by doing that, you provide pure profit for the employer. And that's based on them having a property relation and owning the means of production, right? So this isn't driven by any sort of evil greed necessarily on the part of managers. It's just because of market conditions and competitive pressures. The more you can expand, the greater share of that surplus value and profit you can accrue. But this also means that it pushes employers, like Marx indicated centuries ago, to practice wage theft and to find any way that they can to steal little bits of time and retain, you know, that extra bit as whether it be in the monetary equivalent or in the time equivalent, to retain that and use that as a way to profit. So we can say that capitalism itself incentivizes employers to engage in wage theft on a systematic basis. However, let's go a little bit more concrete. So we can look at Deliveroo and their model, right? So in the beginning, they had a fixed hourly rate before 2017. Obviously, they needed to make this attractive for people. So 6 to 7 an hour plus an hour £1 per delivery. This then changed to a per delivery piece rate model with no guaranteed hourly pay. Then they added some distance, but then they stopped publishing its minimum fees and just they maintain that on average, our workers, they earn, above the living or minimum wage. However, Bureau of Investigative Journalism recently found, based on their own study with the IWGB, that 1 in 3 riders made less than $8.72 an hour, right? And also earlier this year, Deliveroo said that they basically rely on this self-employment model, and in order for them to continue operating, it's impossible for them to shift to any other model, right? So they kind of admitted that without all of this unpaid labor, they wouldn't be viable, right? It's very sad for them in this economy to not figure out a different way of doing things. But perhaps this is because of a bigger problem with some of this works, which is, I call this sort of, sorry for the word salad here, but incommensurability of demand pull, service production, and piecework. So that basically means that the kind of work that Deliveroo or these sort of consumer, these platforms that are very close to consumer demand, the kind of work that is in terms of services is doesn't really work as a piecework model, right? So you can think of like waiters and cafe staff, bar staff, right? They don't get paid per drink, they get paid per shift because it's kind of unpredictable, right? So traditionally piece rate systems were used in agriculture and goods manufacturing. This works for physical products because you can sort of regulate the labor process. Workers themselves have more control in some ways. They can time bank, Burroway talks about, making out of the system, like adjusting how much effort you put in, right? This doesn't map on to service production because your capacity as a rider or a driver depends on how many people want that at any given time, and then how many other self-employed contractors are coming in to also provide that service, right? So the gig economy, I sort of claim now in this presentation is sort of a demand pull system by nature, and this makes it incommensurable. This ultra lean model is like by its nature irreconcilable with guaranteeing a stable wage with a piecework system. So the gig is up really for this, and you can sort of see that in trade union action and policy. So recently, there's a sort of growing number of campaigns by independent unions like IWGB, ADCU, GMB, to hold platforms to account, to make them pay for wait time, sick pay, holiday pay, and also data transparency. These are mostly being fought at like the legislative level. However, there are other sort of protests and other kinds of consumer pressures and other kinds of campaigns to hold these platforms to account. And this is particularly important because in a situation where you don't have an adequate statutory regulation and you don't have adequate enforcement, only unions and collective bargaining and collective power can provide that counterweight. So you have situations where even like Larry Summers is co-authoring a paper in Harvard arguing that the reason why the US has such extreme inequality and polarization is because of the lack of the threat of strikes and the threat of union power and the lack of collective bargaining, right? So that I'm sort of hoping and that we're going to see some pendulums swinging back towards a bit of a more collectively regulated system, and the platform economy will be sort of swept up in that. So in addition to, union power, there is also legislation that's often co-authored or with some of the unions and some colleagues of us of ours on different academic projects. So there's a status of workers bill, which is in the UK, that's an attempt to make everyone sort of a worker from day one and provide statutory rights from day one. Spain's riders law essentially does that for all delivery riders, which was, you know, written up with the unions, and guarantees labor rights. This made some gig economy companies very afraid, so much that some of them just left the country, like Deliveroo. And then you also have some excellent NYC legislation where it mandates transparency around wages, it guarantees toilet access, it provides many other like essential safety and wage and sort of rights that, you know, the informal economy has lacked for a long time, but the platform economy has brought into enough of the spotlight to make it a priority. And then there's also, France has a new executive order on collective representation of platform workers, which will then help push more of this into the legislative sphere. So that to basically conclude, I think there's a political element that has been brewing for a while. The pandemic has exacerbated a lot of that, and a lot of the public, I think, is getting on board. So Fair Work has done a bit of polling, and the numbers are pretty encouraging that the public support better conditions for gig work, and we'll be releasing some of this this evening and later tomorrow. So that's all for me. I hope that wasn't too long. And yeah, I guess we can open it to Kelly's questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was such a fascinating talk, and you managed to pack so much kind of empirical data and conceptual framework into 30 minutes in a way that still made a lot of sense. And I have two kind of broad areas of reflection, but I also see that we have a lot of really great questions in our Q&A. So I don't want to take up too much time. I think it would be great to turn to these questions as soon as we can. But I'm just curious about how you're conceptualizing unpaid labor overall. And I think taking a bit of a macro view, zooming out and returning to this, returning to the way you're using the Marxist approach to understand what unpaid labor says about kind of labor's declining share of income overall. Would you say that in the Marxist approach, all surplus value is unpaid labor, essentially? I think from our research, you know, we can see that this issue of unpaid labor in the gig economy is incredibly prevalent, but it's also murky and opaque and difficult to calculate and difficult to quantify. And we hear this from workers as well when we ask, how much unpaid time do you spend on this platform compared to the amount of paid time you spend? And because of piece rate models, it's incredibly difficult for workers even to get a sense of the amount of time that might be unpaid. So would you take that view that unpaid labor is a form of surplus value, is a way that labor's share of income is declining in the platform economy overall? I think it's quite difficult to separate those two things. The other general area of reflection that I just wanted to touch on before we move to other questions is, I know that you mentioned at the beginning that you know you wanted to not necessarily in this talk talk about unpaid forms of labor in the home, but Fair Work researches platforms on which work is extremely gendered. And so ride hailing and delivery tend to get a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus in platform research overall. And domestic and care work don't tend to have that much research attention. the Supreme Court decision about Uber that we're all, I think, probably familiar with at this point in February, one of the really important aspects of that decision was that wait time should attract pay and benefits and rights. But immediately after that decision about Uber, there was another decision about a care agency. It wasn't necessarily a platform, that said that the time that workers had to spend sleeping at their job was not, they weren't entitled to be paid for. So I think that there's a discrepancy there. And what we see perhaps is that unpaid labor is prevalent across the whole platform economy and across, similar kinds of service work in the wider economy, but that it's also experienced unevenly, disproportionately, and it falls along these unequal kind of social dimensions. I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Matt. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to all the questions, but if you want to briefly address any of those points, and then we'll dive into people's questions.
Yeah, I'll just answer yours first too. I haven't even had a chance to look through all of them, so maybe you can also help me with that. But yeah, just the first one. I mean, so yeah, all surplus value, all of the production of surplus value comes from unpaid labor, but not all unpaid labor is surplus value. And that's because of the production boundary, which is a thing in classical political economy. Both Ricardo and Marx and Smith, they all have this production boundary. Marina Mazzucato reintroduces the political importance of that production boundary in the value of everything. And I think it's crucial to understand that without unpaid labor, there's no profit, but there is a sort of productive and unproductive boundary. So, and that boundary exists where firms are not actually actively contributing socially to the accumulation of whether it be assets or social use values. And the unproductive part of that boundary means if firms can still have a profit, but they're just sort of leeching off the more productive sectors. I don't want to get too much into that sort of Marxist hole, because I've had so many conversations around what's productive, what's unproductive. To me, it doesn't actually matter that much for what we're talking about, because the point is exploitation exists regardless of whether your labor is productive or not, because in order to make a profit, that firm needs that unpaid component. There needs to be an unpaid labor element. These are around domestic work as well. Like there are, many debates going back in feminist political economy and Marxist political economy around how or why or whether private labor, domestic work in the home, when that becomes part of this, when it becomes actual labor and not just sort of private activity. That's, I think, less important than focusing on when such work is subsumed into market relations, i.e. the wage relation. What happens to that work because of cultural factors? So I think culture is actually very important for political economy. And you can look at historical oppressions and cultural values, the ways that those are constructed over time, and look at the way that the labor market is horizontally and vertically segmented, right? So it's not just women workers who are disproportionately in carrying and cleaning roles. It's also migrant workers who are disproportionately in the platform economy overall, and they are disproportionately being in low-wage service jobs or agency jobs, or that kind of informal or precarious labor historically, right? So that these aren't new issues. The platform economy, in a lot of ways, solidifies or exacerbates them, but that's also geographically specific. So different labor market regimes, different coordinated versus liberal varieties of capitalism, if you want to use that term. These all like that, how the platform economy disrupts or integrates or formalizes the labor market depends on where it is. So, right, I mean, you and I work a lot in on countries outside of Europe, and there's a sort of formalizing element to some of the platforms that can be better than the sort of cash in hand, informal, personal kind of exploitative relationship. So yeah, also the time sleeping is not part of the job. That ruling is interesting. I didn't know about that, so I'll have to check that out. I guess we should turn maybe to some of the questions. Have any?
Yeah, I've been having a scroll through them. I think there's no way we're going to get to all of them, unfortunately, because there are a lot of great questions here. But I thought just to pick up on a couple of threads that you were speaking about just now, we could go to one of Valeria's questions here, which is how, and I've been asked to read these out in full for the recording. So how would you see all this reflecting a wider, as a not UK context? And why might there be differences between the UK and other places?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of answered that a little bit in my long-winded response to what you were asking. So yeah, like the platform economy doesn't affect every place like the same, because every place is different, right? There's different labor laws, there's different cultures, there's different protections, and also there's different, there's different levels of worker power, right? So in Europe, where you have much less overall inequality than the US, or than even, like China or India, there are also like very established trade unions, and there's more legislative power. In some of the developing world, that's not really the case. You don't have as much power. There's more inequality, and the platforms have more of a sort of free reign, because a lot of them are also extremely rich in terms of venture capital. So, if they're not making money through simply extracting fees from workers or surpluses or whatever, they're collecting data, and they're seen as, a potential unicorn or a potential high return, or everyone's looking for the next Uber. But obviously, like, yeah, you have indigenous platform economies in around the world, whether it be China, which we can't really study because political issues, but in India, that it's going to be the most populous country in the world fairly soon, and its platform economy is exploding at the moment. But at the same time, you have Uber drivers both there and in Bangladesh who are actively in debt servitude because the fees that they pay to the people that lease in the cars, plus what they owe to Uber, because sometimes it's in cash, the fees outweigh the actual money that they receive, but they still keep doing it because they need liquidity. They need to eat and feed their families, right? And that's a far more extreme situation than here. But it's worth mentioning, and I think probably this speaks to differences in the context. So maybe we'll get to the next questions.
But yeah, I think an important point of that you made in the talk is that unpaid labor is something that is systemic within the platform economy. And I think that's something that we see in a lot of different places, but the way that it manifests, of course, is contextually contingent, and there are different levels of harm and vulnerability in different places. I think that this is a really interesting question from Nick Clark, which Matt, you might be able to speak to a bit, which is, how do you feel that developing theory around wage theft can be of use to workers themselves? How does this theoretical work support worker organizing and resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. And, I know Nick's done a lot of important work on unpaid labor and sort of helped push me in that direction as well. So I think one of the reasons I am interested in it is because it's politically useful, not only to workers themselves, because obviously when you're more aware of your rights and you're more aware of like, I'm working, I'm getting a wage. My employer wants me to work harder and cut my breaks, or maybe I should put in some more unpaid labor time. If they conceive of it as unpaid labor time, they might not do that, or they might maybe think that I'm just making a rich man richer, and maybe my well-being matters more than this, or maybe I should join a union to learn more of my rights, so I can have a buffer and make sure, like, if I am being taken advantage of, that I have a collective way to stop this, or to change, to have agency over my working conditions. Nick also has another question, I think, that relates to fundas, right? These are like two other kind of interesting aspects that I think maybe we could speak to before time is up. So do we only have like 5 minutes left? Is that roughly?
We've got some time. We've got 4 minutes.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I guess. So platform subscription fee, how do we conceptualize platform subscription fees? Do you think it's also a form of wage theft, like colleague Funda asked? I think in terms of, I guess, charging for access, I don't have my mind made up about this. I think it could absolutely be conceptualized as a form of wage theft, but it could also be conceptualized as a form of rent, and charging for access. But like, I don't think it's really a form of rent, because that is a sort of different propertied relation. But it's very similar, because you're renting access to the platform essentially by paying these fees, but then you're also it's also sort of just taking out a cut of what you would be making, and that is going straight to their profit. So I mean, this relates to some of the ongoing discussions and in an academic context about the sort of rentierization, and how rentierization is part of the platformization of society. I think it's an open question. I think, and then value of pension contributions, deferred wages, evaded. Yes, I have considered this. I don't really have any. I have a lot of notes on this, Nick. So there's a question: do you also consider the value of pension contributions, deferred wages, evaded through self-employment model, presumably, as a consequence of misclassification? And I think there's an argument to be made for that. There is some research on the proliferation of self-employed contracts and how businesses save a lot of money on this. And I think any kind of reduction in pension is obviously a form of wage theft. For example, UCU and USS and Universities UK are currently in a dispute right now, and I would support striking over that, because we're losing up to 10K a year for me, for example. This is wage theft, yes, but in terms of the platform economy, I don't have much data on that. So I think we have to wrap up now.
Sure. Well, we've got 1 minute. Perhaps there's time to sneak one more question in. I was thinking that Mariana's question here might be a good one, which is, have you been able to quantify this wage theft in terms of hours, in terms of unpaid hours?
I mean, only in sort of self-reported contexts. In terms of a survey, I'd like to do something more systemic. This is mainly qualitative research to develop like what kinds there are, like more in depth, and really understand the schema first. I think with some more resources, we could do a much bigger survey and try to quantify that. I do know that, though, that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, in collaboration with IWGB, they had a rough calculation of all unpaid hours, just in terms of like wait time, like comparing login time versus time that they got versus the amount they got paid per drop. And that's a more comprehensive, but just for Deliveroo. I think to do something on the platform economy as a whole, or something, or of all gig workers, would be really important research that maybe a trade union could help fund or something. But it's also very difficult because there's obviously through the presentation there's so many different forms, and it depends on what you consider and how you can even some of the metrics are really hard to value. So
on that point, I just wanted to give a quick plug for the Fair Work Cloud Work survey, which did survey a number of workers. I think roughly 700 workers on the proportion of unpaid time they spent on online remote platforms, and we'll be publishing on that soon. But we're out of time. Thank you everybody so much for your questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I'm not sure whether there might be a chance to answer them afterwards. Isabel, I'll hand back over to you now to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Matt, for that amazing insight today. And thank you to the audience for attending. And what we'll do is we'll actually try and make sure that you get copies of all the questions and see if we can answer some of them in the follow-up email. So apologies for not being able to get them all today, but thank you everyone for attending. And Matt and Kelly can be found on Twitter if you want to contact them and send questions, or you can go to the Fair Work website. Kelly, would you just remind of the Fair Work website, please?
It's very easy. It's fair.work.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. We wish you a wonderful evening. And for all of our future events, please do check out our website. If you look on the events section, you'll see everything that's coming up. And you'll also be able to find the recordings of the sessions that we've had already on the video section. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. And we will see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, feel free to get in touch with me via email or Twitter or wherever. I'm easy to find. Thanks, everybody. I'll try to answer some of the questions in email if possible.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.